Welcome. In today's Build a Product Catalog presentation, we're going to cover how to build an MVC Web Application to manage and interact with the data in our existing catalog. So before we begin, let's quickly recap what we have covered thus far. In our first discussion, we started out by looking at how to understand what makes up a product catalog and walked you through a use case for designing a generic real-world product catalog. First, we started by defining a product catalog as a place to store information about products. Next, we went on to identify the different parts of a catalog, such as the product, category, images, and vendor information, wrapping up this with an understanding of how the catalog's components can relate to one another. In the second discussion, we expanded our view of our catalog by looking at the possible ways to store your data, primarily focusing on the different types of data files we can use in regards to storing our captured product data. We then switched over to a demo of various types of applications you can use to create and maintain data files, concluding a walkthrough of how to convert our data files into a database. Finally, in our last presentation, we took our database and connected it to an application. In this case, we created a standalone application using a Java and Spring MVC Eclipse IDE. The purpose of this application was to connect to our database and also test the core functionalities of our catalog, namely the ability to create, read, update, and delete data in and out of the database. Which brings us to today's lesson, where we will expand on our database and application knowledge by taking our application to the next step. We will start by converting our existing standalone application into a web application. We will start by reusing the Java and Spring IDE again. We will also include some additional libraries and programs, such as the Spring MVC framework and an Apache Tomcat server, which will make the process of converting our standalone application easier, thus giving us a new application that is accessible over the internet. Before we begin, though, let's first talk about a little about the MVC framework and why we want to use it. So the MVC, or Model View Controller, is an architectural pattern that separates an application into three main logical components: the model, the view, and the controller. Each part is built to handle a particular development aspect of an application. Another reason we want to use MVC is that it is one of the most frequently used industrial standard web development frameworks used to create scalable and extensible projects. Let's begin by looking at the components themselves, starting with the model. The model component corresponds to all the data-related logic that the user works with and can represent either the data that is being transferred between the view and the controller components or any other business logic related data. We will take a look at this a little later in our demo, which will cover how to use our product objects with its corresponding view and controller classes to receive some product information. We would like to manipulate it and then save the changes back to the database. The next part of the MVC we are going to cover is the view. The view component is primarily used for all the display or user interface logic of an application. For our purposes, this means the product view will include all the UI components such as text boxes, drop-downs, etc. that can be interacted with by the user. Last, we will have the controller. The controllers act as an interface between the model and view components. Its primary function is to process all the business logic, manage incoming requests, and manipulate data by using the model components and interacting with the corresponding views to render the final output. In our example, the product controller will handle all the interactions and inputs from the product view and update the database using the product model. Also, the same controller will be used to display all products and remove the product data. Now that we know what MVC is, what are some of the requirements necessary to build an application with MVC? For starters, you need to have some basic web development skills to build software. However, don't worry. If you lack the necessary skills to go beyond this step, there are many examples and tutorials on the web. Plus, we have some examples and other video tutorials on Developreneur to help you get started quickly. With that being said, for the rest of this class, we'll be assuming that you have some experience in web development. Next, you need to consider what programming languages you wish to use. You can choose between many different languages such as C#, Java, PHP, or any other programming language that supports database integration. For this lesson, we are going to use the Java programming language with the Spring MVC framework. Finally, you need to pick an application server. Unlike standalone applications, which run locally on a machine, web applications are deployed and run on application servers on remote computers. These servers allow the application to be accessible from any device connected to the internet or intranet. There are many application servers to choose from. Some of the most popular are Tomcat, WebLogic, and WebSphere. For this lesson, we'll be using the Tomcat server libraries that come with the Spring STS install. So let's review our use case. So in today's lesson, we are going to build a basic model view controller application, which will connect to our database. We will have an interface that will allow the user to enter in a new record. They will have the ability to edit an existing record. We will also give them a button so that they can delete a record. And we will also give them a home page to allow them to select the multiple between the multiple components of the catalog. For example, they could select product, they could select vendor. By selecting each of the individual components of the catalog, we will display a list of all the existing records that are in the catalog. If you go back to our previous lesson where we covered databases and the different types of data types and applications you can use, we're essentially building the GUI components of something like DB Visualizer or Query Analyzer. So what screens will we need to build? Well, let's think about it. So unlike the last lesson where there was no GUI, we actually built the application. It was a standalone application, and then we actually built the components directly into our program to insert, update, delete, and query our database. Well, in this particular lesson, we actually have to have user components. We have to have a GUI. GUI stands for Graphical User Interface. That basically allows the user to interact with our application. Because we're using a web application, these pages will be displayed in a web browser, be it IE, Firefox, Netscape, or whatever your favorite browser is. So as I said before, we pretty much want a way for the user to come in and select a particular catalog component, be it product or vendor. Once you select which component you want to work with, we're going to display a list of all the records in a nice user-friendly table on the screen. Within that table, we will also provide buttons for editing and deleting that individual record. We will also add a button to the top of our table that will allow us to add new products or new vendor data to our database. We'll also have to create a page for displaying an individual product or vendor information so that the user can either add the new information or edit existing information and give them the ability to cancel their changes or save their changes back into the database. Before we begin building out our use case, we need to get a few things first. Just like in the previous discussions, we will continue to use the Java as our programming language for coding purposes. In addition to Java, we will also be using the Spring framework. So this framework is an open source application framework and in version of control container from or for the Java platform. Its core features can be used by any Java application, but there are extensions for building web applications on top of the Java EE platforms. Unfortunately, a lot of that may not have made much sense to you. Don't worry. For now, just know that the Spring framework is going to be used to help simplify how we connect to our database. In essence, it's going to help give us a very easy way to build our application without having to do too much boilerplate. In addition to using Java and Spring, we will also be using the Spring Tool Suite. The Spring Tool Suite is an Eclipse-based development environment that is customized for developing Spring applications. It is freely available for development and internal business operations use with no time limits. It's fully open source and licensed under the terms in Eclipse public licensing. Finally, we will be using the Tomcat install that is provided with the STS Eclipse installer to deploy our MVC applications. If you need the download links to get the software, please refer back to our previous lesson. So what are the basic building blocks of our MVC project? Well, for starters, let's talk about dependencies or third-party libraries. These are pre-built libraries from third parties that provide us with some additional classes and methods to help simplify the process of building an application. To use these dependencies, you must add them to the Maven POM file from our existing project. We will continue to use the Spring Jdbc, Spring-TX, and MySQL-connector-Java dependencies. However, to use MVC, we will need to add some additional dependencies such as the Spring-Context, Spring-Web MVC, cglib-nodep for building our MVC configuration classes, servlet-API, and JSP-API. We will also want to add some additional dependencies like the JSTL tag library, log4j, and slf4j for logging. The Java Server Pages Standard Tag Library, JSTL, is a component of the Java EE Web Application Development Platform. It extends the JSP specification by adding a tag library of JSP tags for common tasks, such as XML data processing, conditional executions, database access, loops, and internalization. As for log4j and slf4j, these are just simple logging facades for Java. They will be required to help us manage our application's logging. Now, let's discuss data access objects, or DAOs. Their primary use is to abstract and encapsulate all the access to the data source, for which the DAO manages the connection with the data source to obtain and store data. In this exercise, this requires moving the logic from our previous discussions, Jdbc Template example, to the corresponding DAO. So this will require us to create the following methods: save or update, where we pass in our object; delete, where we pass in an int ID for our record ID; get, where we again pass in the int and ID for our record in our table; and then we also need a method for list that returns a list of our objects that will be used for our select. As for our controllers, they need to be able to interact between our model and views. So for the case of product, we will need the following mapper methods: edit product, save product, delete product, and new product. We can duplicate these mappers for the other tables in our database. Simply replace the word product with the appropriate table, namely vendor or images. Next, let's look at the views that will be required to interact with our data. These will be product.jsp and productform.jsp. The product.jsp will be used to display a list of all records in the table. Each record will also contain a link to edit or delete the record. The page will also contain a new product link to go to the productform.jsp to add, edit new products. Finally, the MVC configuration file is new since Spring 3. The Java configuration, or @configuration, has been moved into the Spring core libraries. Therefore, coders can now convert an existing servlet.xml file into a Java configuration file by extending the Web MVC Configure adapter class. In layman's terms, this allows us to move the servlet configuration settings from XML into a Java class within our project. I typically find this easier to maintain this way, but you can do it either way. You can do it in XML or you can do it in Java. So now that we've covered all the basics, let's go out and build our project. So we're going to start by building a new Spring Legacy MVC project. We're going to merge our previous code logic into our new project, and then we're going to create MVC components for product and vendor. Now I've already built the components for product. So in our particular example, we're going to continue adding some additional pieces to our catalog, and we're going to build out the vendor piece. Okay, let's go look at the demo. So last time we created our product catalog application to communicate with our database. In here, we had a couple classes for our product data object and our product Jdbc template example. So our product data object is essentially a plain old Java object, or POJO, that just contains all the getters and setters to the variables that we defined that matched our database table. So if you remember, our database looks something like this. So here we have a product catalog table, or a product catalog database, our tables, our product table, with our columns product ID, category ID, name, summary, description, price, and quantity. And as you can see, we have the corresponding values in our POJO. Then we defined our product Jdbc Template example class to actually interface and communicate with that particular table in our database. So in here, we have our little main method that opens up a connection to the database. We create a Jdbc template with our database so that we can actually communicate and interact with the database. We then used our inserts, updates, selects, and deletes to pull the values in and out of our database. So that was our simple example in the previous session. In this session though, we're going to move all this into an MVC application and have a web interface on top of this. So we're going to start out by creating a new MVC application, and then we're going to pull the pieces over from this particular session and reuse them in our new application, but in a different way. So we'll take a look at that. So to do that, we need to go to File, New, Project, Spring Legacy Project. And for our project name, we're going to call this one Product Catalog 4. We're going to select Spring MVC Project, and we're going to do Next. And we got to give it a package name, so com.demo.catalog, and finish. So this has now built us a template project for Spring MVC. So we now have our top level packages like we did before. So we have source main Java, source main resources, tests, and resources. So the first thing we need to do is we need to add some additional packages so that we can start creating our MVC components. So we'll start out by adding a new package under com demo catalog called config. And we'll create another one, controller. Next we have our data access objects, DAO. And model for our model classes. So our model classes are going to be the easy part. We've already built these. These are our POJOs. So we go to our previous project and we select product and vendor, and we can copy those and we can paste them right into the model package. Again, these are just the plain old Java objects. So these have corresponding class variables to map to our database table and the setters and getters and our default constructor. Next, we need to create an interface for our data access objects. So we create a new interface, and we call this one product DAO. And in here, we have our public interface. So in our presentation, we talked about needing 4 methods to interface with our table. These are save or update, delete, and list. We use Java util list, and we're going to use our com demo catalog model product. So our save or update, we're going to pass in a product object to update. Delete, we're going to pass in the product ID. Get, we're going to pass in the product ID to get that particular record. And then list is to return the list of all products in our database. Okay, we're going to do the same thing for vendor. And under vendor, we're just going to replace everything that's product with vendor. We are case sensitive here, so we just have to be a little careful. And as you can see, we're now importing com demo catalog model vendor. So now we have our DAO interfaces, but now we need to create our implementations. So we need to create a new class. And this is going to be our product DAO implementation class. Its interface is going to be product DAO. And finish. So as you can see, when you create a new class that implements the product DAO, it automatically inherits all the interface methods that we defined in the interface. So now we need to add some information to our class here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to continue to use Jdbc Template. So we need to define a local class variable, Jdbc Template. And apparently I'm missing a dependency. We'll grab that in just a minute. So we got Jdbc Template, and then we need to also pass in our data source into our DAO implementation so that we actually know how to connect to our data source. So we're going to use the Java XSQL data source. Boom. And don't worry about the red for Jdbc Template. We'll address that in just a minute. We're just missing the class dependency. I'm apparently still missing one in our POM file. We'll find that in just a second. All right, so save or update product. So we're passing in our product. So what we need to do is we need to get essentially the SQL information we had previously in our product Jdbc template file. So this is going to be the insert and update information. So we have our insert and update. We'll copy those. And we go over here and save or update, paste those. Control-Shift-F formats. All right, so we now have two different values in save or edit. So how do we know when we want to do an insert or an update? Well, that's actually fairly easy. So what you need to do is you take the product and you go, well, if our product.get product ID is 0, we want to do an insert. And why do we want to do an insert on 0? Well, if product ID is 0, that means we don't have a product ID yet. So this is actually a brand new product. If we had a product ID, then we would want to do the update. So then all we need to do is else. And there we go. So now I'm saying, okay, insert into product or category ID, name, etc. For the insert. And we pass in 0 for the category ID because we don't really have a category at this moment. But we don't pass in the product ID anywhere. That lives in the update. And in the update, we're going to change our set here to actually update all the fields. So give me a second here. So we're going to modify this. And I'm going to, already got this pre-typed so we can simplify this a little bit. So what we have here now is SQL update, which does an update or an insert. We are passing in the category ID, the name, the summary, the description, our price, and our quantity. And all that's coming from our pre-populated product. Otherwise, we want to update all the values in our table. Well, as you can see here, we're only setting description where the product ID equals ID. We actually want to expand on that. So what we will do is we will actually replace these two lines with this. So here we have string SQL update. We're now updating the product. We're setting all the values where the product ID equals the ID from our product. So very similar to our previous update, with the exception of now we're actually passing in the product ID for our where condition. So that's it for the save and update. The delete, come down here and we copy out this comment delete, and we go into delete, comment, and now here we're doing SQL delete from product, where product ID equals question. Now we also have SQL delete and product ID. So now we are deleting a specific product from our table. If you just had delete from product without the word condition, you're going to be hurting a little bit. That will actually truncate your table and delete all records that are in your table. All right, now we want to get all of our values, or we want to get a specific record from the database. So we go back over here and we pull this guy here. So we can actually simplify life a little bit. So we can, let's see, which one do I want to do? I want the SQL select. Start with this guy, come back over. We're actually going to do the list first since I've already defined the list. So here we have, oops, format, there we go. So here we're doing a select star from product. So this is going to return us all the products that are in our table. Well, we want to do it to a mapper. So we connect to row mapper, product, Jdbc template, and then we map like we did before. So now this is going to return every single record that is in our table. Return product, and then I need to return our list. There we go. Don't worry again about the red underline. I'm just missing a dependency. All right, so now for the get, we just want one record. So we modify this guy here. And instead of a list, we want a product. Actually, let me simplify this. We'll save a lot of typing here. So what we will do here is we are going to do a string select where product ID equals product ID, and then we're going to do a Jdbc template query. We're going to do pass in the select, and then we're going to do a result set extractor from product, and then we this is an interclass override. So we create an override for product, extract data, and then we map our individual values. Now, really, this is a duplication of efforts. What we probably want to do is we probably want to pull this out into a separate method. But for now, we're just taking our previous example and moving that over to an MVC application. So we'll start with that. And that is pretty much everything that needs to go into our implementation file. So let me clean up our exceptions here. So let's go look at our POM file and see what we're missing. Oh, I forgot to copy over the dependencies. That's what I did. Okay. So what we need to do is we go to our previous example. We go to our POM file. And then in here, we need the, let's see, Spring Jdbc. I believe that was missing. Yes. Okay. So we need all of our Jdbc classes. We need our Spring text for the transaction. That gives us the Jdbc template. We need the MySQL connector jar so that we can connect to MySQL. Start with those. Paste them here at the top. And then the other thing we need is going to be, where is it? The CG lib dependencies, and that's so that we can actually modify. Oops. This dependency is going to allow us to create a class for our XML file instead of having to actually load our XML file into, or actually put all of our configurations, instead of being in the servlet XML file, we can actually put it into a Java class file. So we'll save that. The artifact failure. Oh yeah, I need a version number, and he is going to be 2222. All right, it's pulling all the dependencies, missing Jdbc template. What else am I missing? Oh, previous example is also Java version 7. We also need to upgrade our Spring framework release to 4. 1.6.10, 1.6.6, that looks good. Data project. Oh. Aha! Now that I've added the dependencies, we now have to add our imports. So save that. So now I have one issue with row mapper. What's row mapper complaining about? Oh, it pulled the wrong row mapper. We actually wanted the org Spring Jdbc core framework, not the tree framework. So save that. Boom. There we go. Okay, so now we have our DAO. So as you can see here, we got the select product ID, extract data, and the vendor is going to essentially be the same thing. So we'll do file, file new, class, vendor, DAO, implementation, vendor. And if we go back up to our previous example again, there's our insert, update, select, and we'll pull all that in. I've already done that to simplify time. For time, we'll just copy and paste it over, and we'll walk through it. So again, we have our vendor DAO implementation, just like our product. It implements the vendor DAO. We need to instantiate a Jdbc template locally. We will pass in our data source so that we can use our database. Again, we check to see if the vendor ID is 0. If it is, we do an insert. Otherwise, we do an update. In delete, we delete by vendor ID, not just by vendor. If you just delete from vendor, remember, you truncate your table. Our get, where vendor ID, so we pass in our unique vendor ID primary key, and that will map to a vendor object, which we can then use. And we have list, which selects all from vendor and returns a list array. So cool. We now have our model. We now have our database transactions. So now we need a controller to kind of communicate between, actually we need to create our views, but what the controller will do is the controller will map between our models and views and allow us to pull the data from the database, display it on the screen, and then take the information from our screen and then pass it back to the database. So let's go create a controller. In this particular case, we're going to need 3 controllers. So we already have our home controller. By default, it puts it in root. I don't like it really being there, so we'll move it up to controller. So we now have our home controller. Let's take a look at what's in this guy. So this guy actually takes us to a page right now that says welcome home. The client local time is, and it will pull the locale and format the date, time, and return the time. As an so you get server time passed back to the JSP view. The current JSP views We haven't looked at those yet, so let's expand that. So let's go to Source, Main, Web Apps. So under Web Apps, we have a WebM folder, which contains our views. And here we currently have a home.js page. And the home.js page is simply hello world. And it will write out the server time on the server is server time. This represents a JSP tag ID, which is defined in home controller right here where we set the attribute. So in our presentation, we mentioned that we need some additional pages or additional views here. So let's quickly just build out the views. So we're going to need, and we'll just start real simple. We'll just copy the home again, and we need a product. We need a vendor. Oops. We need a product form. And we need a vendor form. All right, so start with product. So product is going to look something like this. So our title of our page is going to be product. We're going to create a header that says product list. We're going to add a link to a new product controller or a new tag link, which will map that in our product controller in a minute for new product. This will create or take us to the product forms page for us to enter in a new product. Then we're going to create an HTML table, and we're going to essentially define the column IDs for our product. Our JSTL tags are defined here. This allows us a for each, which lets us loop through a list of products, and then we can actually pull out each of the values from the product ID. So we got product ID, category, name, summary, and so forth. We will also create two separate links. We're going to create one that we'll call edit product and one that we'll call delete product. Again, these will be mapped in our controller file to our data objects to where we'll actually be editing and deleting the records. So delete will delete the record, should come back to this page. Edit will take us to the product form page. And then we have another link at the bottom that's just going to return us to our home page. Our home page is going to be really simple now. So in our home page, we're going to get rid of this hello world, and we're actually going to make it a little more useful. So it'll still be home, but instead our header is going to be select product catalog table. This is going to give us a link to select either the product or vendor tables and print out the system time. Save these. All right, now let's go look at product form. So product form is going to look something like this. Now, I know I'm showing you a lot of different code by copying and pasting here. I'm not going to specifically get into all the in and outs of HTML, JSPs, and all the syntax. This is just mainly meant to be a high-level guide to kind of show you how to progress through the product catalog and go from an application to an MVC Spring application. We will be covering these in more detail later, but for now, just bear with us. This is a high-level approach, and I will be providing the source code so you can go out and play with this yourself. But due to time constraints, though, I can't get too detailed on how this works. So here we are on the product form page. This is just a straight up, it's going to be an HTML form using the form JSTL tag. Define our form action, save product. This is essentially the same as the edit product links. Once you click save product, it will call back to the server side and look for the controller with the save product annotation tied to it. We're going to do it as a post, not a get. So we're going to push the information back to the server without putting the individual values of our fields in the URL. And we're going to model it off of product. So it's going to take all these values and they're going to push over as a product class. So product ID, all these will map to this corresponding field in the product. Form hidden. Well, we don't really want to display the product ID, and since right now we're not mapping the category ID, we're just going to leave those hidden. So they will be populated behind the scenes when the page loads, but the user won't actually see them. What the user will see, though, is going to be the name of the product, the summary, the description, the price, and quantity. Then they will have the option to save or go back to the previous screen by hitting cancel. Okay, so that's product. Vendor, same thing, just with the vendor information. So again, we have our table and we have our loop that will loop through all of our vendors and display a table or populate our rows of our table with all of our vendor information. That was missing from the other one. So we go back to product. Yep, that's there. Okay, good. All right, so now vendor form. Vendor form. Here we go again, but this time we're just going to update the vendor name. We could expand this out to be all the fields, but for now I'm just simply going to show you how this works in 2 examples. All right, so now we have our views, we have our models, we have our data access objects, or basically our database transaction classes, and we now have we have our home controller. Well, now we need to actually create some additional controllers and actually update this home controller. So home controller comes to root and just does some basic information, but we want to have it do just a little bit more. So we're now going to say welcome home, client local. We still have our date, time, everything else looks good. We return home. So really not too much change. I just added some additional comments. But let's go look at our product catalog or product controller. So we do new class product controller. So this guy, we set the annotation as controller. So now he is defined in Spring as a controller class. So now he gets registered at runtime as a controller. So any URLs you have mapped in here for request mapping get defined at runtime. So now if I click a link that says product, it will call the product method here. If I call a link that says edit product, it will kick off this edit product method here, and so forth and so on. So we have save, delete, and new. So in our controller, what we're doing now is we're saying, okay, someone's clicked on a particular product. So I get the date, time. So I again pull the server time, but then I'm going to pull a list of products. So product is from the home page. We're basically going to our product view. So this should list all of our products. So we define our list of products. We have our product DAO, and we call list. Now our product DAO, you're wondering, well, where did that guy come from? Well, we have an auto wire here, which automatically wires the product DAO bean to this controller class. Now, we haven't configured that yet, but we will do that in a minute in our config. We'll come back to this guy in just a moment. So here we call our product DAO, which ties to our product DAO class. But we're passing by interface, so we can go to the interface, which simplifies a lot of our the code that you have to pass around. So we go back to our controller, we close the others. We're starting to get a little crowded up there. There we go. So now we have a list of products. But how do we get the products from the server back to the page? Well, to do that, you need to set in the model, you need to add an attribute. We're going to call it products. and we're going to pass our list of products back over to our product view. So if we go look at our product view, there's our products. So now we're listing through looping through a list of products, and we're pulling out the values and displaying it in the table. For edit product, so that returns the string. The string is actually the name of the view. Then we have another request mapper for model and view. This is slightly different because we actually want to redirect to another page. So here, model and view is triggered when you click a link edit product. We're getting the request, meaning whatever we pass in can be pulled out of the request from a form ID or a parameter. So in our case, request.getParameterID is going to give us our product ID. We're going to parse it to an integer because it comes over as a string. So we now have our product ID. And then we pass the product ID into our DAO get, which should return us a single product. We then take that product and we map it to an object. Whereas here we're mapping to an attribute, here we're mapping to an object. So the model and view model, we are now going to create a new model page for product form and then pass it the product object. So it will now map our product to the object that it's looking for on our product form. So let's go look at the product form view. Product form. As we come in here, model attribute product. So that ties us in. Oops. Product. And that's how. So now we don't have to actually do product.name, product.id, because we're essentially mapping the form to our product object. It's just another way of kind of simplifying some of the boilerplate code for working with data objects and server models. All right, so we got another request mapping for save product. Take the same idea for edit, but in this case we're saving, so we're getting a product, not an ID. We're actually passing the model attribute product back. We're calling our product DAO to save and update, and then we're redirecting back to product. So this is going to go back to our main product list, and now we should see the product added to the list or the changes added to the list. Delete product, same idea. We're getting the request, we're getting the ID, calling the delete, and redirecting back to product. New product, slightly different. Remember, we don't have a product ID, so it should just create us a new product object and update, pass a blank product object to our form. So when you do call save, you will have a 0 product ID, and it will generate a new product ID and refresh the list. Moving right along, so now we need to create our vendor controller. So I'm going to shortcut this, and we're going to do vendor controller. So vendor controller, anywhere where I see product, I can change it to vendor. Lowercase p and lowercase v. Because of the naming conventions I'm using and the fact that I thought through my variable names before I actually built this, it's just as simple as copying and pasting, manipulating the variable names to point to your exact table name. In our case, this time is vendor, previously it was product. We could do the same thing for image and so on. Because essentially all we're building right now is a way of mapping or way of manipulating our database from a GUI. So nothing else has changed. It's still the same method calls. So now we have our controller, we have our DAO, we have our model, and we have our view. Now we're really close to being done. If we were to try to run this right now, we would get to the home controller, but nothing would work because we're missing something. We're missing this last little piece here for the auto wires. So how are we going to get the product IDs passed around correctly and our data objects passed around? Well, that's where the config file comes in. Typically, this would be inside of your servlet XML file, but now we're actually going to do all this in Java. So we're going to create a new class, and this will be your MVC, MVC Configuration class. And he extends the Web MVC Configuration adapter. So what do we need here? Well, we need a resolver. So we need to tell the server how to get to our views and what suffix are files that we want to load. In our case, they're all JSP files. So we set the resolver for web-inf views to JSP. We also want to override the add resource handler so we can actually add some additional resources that get loaded at runtime so that our application or the web page has access to them. In our case, we're going to allow all the resources under the resource, or all the files under the resource path, to be added to the web resource URL. This is also where we define our database connection, our data source. So here we take the same driver manager data source that we had in our previous examples, but instead of defining this in each of our classes where our DAOs or our Jdbc Web Template or Jdbc Template classes are used, we do this in the configuration file. So now when we call get data source, this guy gets passed around. So if we go back and look at our product DAO implementation, as you can see here, the data source gets passed in at the constructor. Well, where is this guy actually used? Well, he's actually used at the controller level. So here we're auto wiring product DAO. But as you notice, we're not actually dropping anything in. So product DAO gets auto wired, but we're never actually putting the data source in there. So let's keep looking at our configuration here. So now we come down here. Now we actually define our beans. So our product DAO object that we are using in our DAO implementations, in our controllers, is coming from the AutoWire here. So AutoWire comes up and will pull in this get product DAO and map it to our product DAO. And then we have our product DAO implementation, and this is where we are setting the data source. So we define that here. So we don't have to do this within our code. So if we go look at our product controller, here we are, AutoWire, product DAO, product DAO. By doing this, it's going to pull the product DAO from here. Slick. All right, that should be everything. So now to run our application, we need to deploy it to Tomcat. So we right click on our project, we go run as, and we can select run on server. And since Tomcat 9 is installed by default with this version of Spring STS, we will select Tomcat 9, restart the server. You'll see it down here in your little window. It's stopping, it's loading. Okay, server started, we're synchronized. Let's go view it. All right, so here's our home page. So as you can see, we have a link to product and vendor. So if I click product, it takes me to the list of all the products in my product catalog. Got a new product. There's our product screen. So let's give it a product name, say Sonic Screwdriver. Summary, David Tennant's screwdriver. Let's see what description. Makes lots of noise. Yeah, noise. And price, we'll say it's $49.99, and we have 2 in stock. So we save, and we come back and now see real time that we've just added a new product to our product catalog. Now I have a bunch of dummy data in here for some previous examples I've done. So say I want to get rid of those, I can just hit delete. As you can see, they fall off the list. And say I want to update this one to be something a little more descriptive, I can click edit. And we can say Tom Baker's scarf. Warm scarf. Description worn by Tom Baker. And we'll change the price to say $50, and we have 20 in stock. And boom, we've now updated our record. So now if we go back to home, we can go to our vendor and do the exact same thing here. But remember, for vendor, we only added the name field, so we can just say Toys R Us. Save. So we've now added Toys R Us. If we want to add all the additional information to our vendor field, we have to add them to the form. So quickly recap, we have taken everything that we did originally in our product catalog that connected to the database, and we have now expanded that into a model view controller application that you can interact with from the web. So in our application, this looks very similar now to something like Jdbc Template or DB Visualizer, where you can actually go in and edit the table data directly. So if I go click on product, columns data. So it's very similar to this view here that's not just in DB Visualizer, but in most SQL editor type applications or wizards. So let's recap. So we've converted our application to a Web MVC application. So what does that mean? Well, that really means we now have a way of accessing or having customers or vendors access our data, our product catalog from a website. So now our sites or product catalogs become a little bit more user friendly, a little more usable, and we're starting to see it evolve into something more enterprise. Going forward, we will discuss some additional topics like reporting and using our product catalog with WordPress. We'll also talk about some additional topics like testing using Selenium and unit tests to actually test our applications. So stay tuned. Well, thank you for listening today. Send any questions, comments, or requests for assistance to info@developer.com, or drop us a line on our website, on any of our blogs, or sign up for our mentoring class and come join the fun. Thanks. Have a great day.